Hello, everyone. This is another edition of British and American Culture. We're now on week 10. I'm your host, Professor Sullivan. So many things to talk about today. Quiz on Wednesday when this is posted. Quiz number 5. Everybody already knows that already, and by the time you watch this, your quiz will be over. About my beard. Nobody in this class has said anything because you're all respectful students, but I am. I don't normally look like this. I've been growing the hair on my face since February, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is for fun, and the other one is so that I can look like Ulysses S. Grant by the time we get to the American Civil War. He was the commander at the end of the war. He was the commander of the North, of the Union armies, and later he became president for 2 terms, a Republican president after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and his vice president has his term, Andrew Johnson, I think his name was. Other than looking like Ulysses S. Grant, also Canadians have a tradition of not shaving their face during hockey season until your team gets knocked out. So that's another factor. Once we get past the Civil War and I don't need my Ulysses S. Grant beard and my hockey team gets knocked out of the playoffs, then I can shave because then it won't be bad luck. All right. I want to talk about Ireland today first. And the thing I always say is this course is not about Irish culture, and Irish culture is not British culture. They influence each other in a variety of ways, and the relationship is very complicated, but Irish language is its own. The 2 cultures have coexisted since records have been kept. Their history goes back, to pre-Roman era as well. Maybe at some point, the people, 10,000 years ago, originated from the same genetic pool. That's possible. But what we're interested in talking about is the relationship to British culture. What is Ireland? It's probably the most important, along with, France, the most important culture that influences British culture, because they tried to incorporate Ireland into the British Empire, but they refused for a number of reasons, which we can all understand. We talked about the demerits of imperialism last class, which there are more than just the ones I named, but the big ones we talked about. So we're at the beginning of chapter 5, and there's really just a couple pages here, and it needs to be edited, it needs to be improved and expanded. My family name is Sullivan, which is from the Irish surname O'Sullivan, which means dark-eyed one, but it works well for my kids because my kids are half Korean and they have dark eyes and dark hair, but I actually have green eyes. But my father has brown eyes, and that's what my name means. There's lots of Sullivans. It's a very common name. There's lots of famous Sullivans. American Sullivans are it's a very popular name, very common. So the thing about Ireland that's most important is that colonialism is a fundamental part of what the empire becomes. As you know, the United States exists because of the colonization of North America. It was a policy that was developed by the British government, and basically it was a way to offload excess population. That's the way the British looked at it, especially in the 17th century, is that what do we do with these people who don't have jobs and they're not productive, or there's not enough space for them, or we don't have enough food for them, various reasons. we're just going to transfer them to other colonies. So Australia develops like that too. It's a not a fact. It's a historical, policy that people who get in trouble in one way or another in English society are going to end up in the colonies. There's also, as you know, there's also there's wealthy people that are trying to invest, and they're trying to find gold and produce things, and there's ownership of new resources, and there begins to be this kind of commercial relationship between the British Isles and their colonies, and it's got this great big feedback loop. We've talked about how slavery is a very important cog in the wheel of imperialism, and of course ships are also going to be necessary because you need transportation. In fact, the term transportation is kind of a negative one, where like if you get transported to the colonies, that means basically you're getting kicked out, right? In some cases you could, you would have a choice, go to jail or be transported, right? Some people would prefer to be kicked out of England rather than rot in jail, and some people considered transportation a fate similar to death. In the 1620s and 1630s, the people who lived in Jamestown, between the disease and the weather and the fighting with the natives, the death rate was 50% or above for the first couple decades. That's one of the reasons that this indentured servant thing worked out quite well for the planters in Virginia, is because people would come and they would hope they would work for 7 years and do their labor, and then after that they would get some land and they would be free. But if you signed up for 7 years and then you died after 5 years, that was good for the plantation owner, because he got 5 years labor out of you basically for free, and then you just transport the next person over, and that person died before the 7 years was up too. But towards the end of the 17th century, the death rate levels off, and a lot of the laborers start living through their servitude and having their own property, which for the wealthy, what do they call it, burgess, these upper class, they're like bourgeoisie, they're like wealthy American aristocrats. Like I said, the first 5 presidents were American, so they start to not want this competition and not want too many free or wealthy landowners in the area. So then they start employing slaves, and of course buying a slave was very expensive, getting a ship to bring somebody over from anywhere, and it was illegal. One of the other reasons why African slaves were permitted is because it was illegal to enslave. The Pope made it illegal for you to enslave Christian, especially a Christian European. So the Africans were not Christian and they were not European. So it was kind of a religious loophole and a legal loophole, in addition to the fact that they could color code. The Irish, though, were some of the original slaves. They were treated, they were discriminated against. They weren't necessarily treated the same as, I'm not saying they're equivalent or anything, but at the beginning, when there was less Atlantic slave trade between North America, it already existed with Portugal and Spain in South America and Mexico. They've already got that system going, but for the most part, there was very few comparatively in the North American colonies. But as I said, after the Revolutionary War, this will pick up speed. But back at the beginning, in the 17th century, of course, anybody who was in Ireland was going to have to deal with Oliver Cromwell, for example. It was if you could get out of your situation, big families that were very poor, if you could get out of your situation and get to another part of the empire, you might have a chance of overcoming all of the oppression that was being regularly affected on Ireland. They were just I used the example in class. It's in some sense Irish people who know their history and know their culture identify with Koreans because this is the treatment that the Japanese Empire, imposed on Korea about 100 years ago, right? In the Japanese colonial period, they did the similar things. They tried to control the Koreans by forcing their religious conversion, by making them speak Japanese, by not letting them own lands or have high positions of authority unless they were directly under the supervision of the Japanese imperial government. This is what Ireland had to deal with for 400 years. So you can imagine that if Isunshin had lost and Japan had successfully attacked China through Korea and perhaps annexed Chosun, that you would have had to deal with the Japanese bureaucracy and the Japanese military constantly, right? You would have risen up in rebellion, and you would have been your resources and your unity, your politics and everything would have been just in shambles constantly. Sometimes Ireland revolted, sometimes part of Ireland revolted, sometimes Ireland fought itself, sometimes people, the king was on the Irish side and against his own government. It was all tragic. It was all tragic because if there had been some sort of unifying force or some brilliant hero that was able to destroy the British Navy, Ireland's just too close, though. You don't really have time to have these battles. So, Japan's far enough away that Isunshin could intercept the Japanese, and he could hide in the Jeolla Islands, right, and the Gyeongsang Islands, and ambush the Japanese when he wanted to. But much more difficult for the Irish to do that because the whole country's so close, and there's nobody behind them. Also in the Indian War, China sent tens of thousands of soldiers to fight against the Japanese to shore up the Korean army, which was unable to stop the Japanese. There's really, the only thing that can happen is like the Spanish or the French can take ships and drop them off in Ireland and then help them. But how are they supposed to supply them with the English ships, in between them in the channel? It's very difficult. France was always helping Scotland, and occasionally they were helping Ireland, and the Spanish were helping Irish too, because they're both Catholic, right? They're all Catholic, and in the religious sense, Ireland is closer to them than they are to the English, because the English become Protestant. So you have this religious and cultural and linguistic difference, and the British try to impose their system and their culture on the Irish, which they resist as much as they can for hundreds of years until they finally gain their independence. Less than 100 years ago. Similar, they're still going through the same thing as Korea's trying to gain its independence from Japan, which happened in 1945. So there's various catastrophes. The one that's most well known is the potato famine, when you may know this story where the potatoes have a fungus, and because Ireland is very poor and they don't own very much land, they need to maximize the amount of food that they grow and how much nutrients they get, which turns out the potato grows well in Ireland, and it produces enough food for them to support themselves. Barely. Not even, not comfortably, but barely, avoiding starvation. So there's a fungus, there's a blight, potato blight, that infects all the potatoes, but you couldn't tell because this parasite, this fungus, eats all the potatoes under the ground, but the plant looks okay. So they're not anticipating, being short of food until they go to harvest the potatoes, and they start digging them up in the summer, and they're all garbage. They're uneatable. They're inedible. So this is a great tragedy because they're already on the edge of starvation, and now they have no food. So the estimates are varied, but at least a million Irish people starve. The British didn't intentionally do any of this, but in Belgium and Germany and France and England, they were also growing potatoes, and many people died, but not a million. Thousands of people died, not hundreds of thousands, because they weren't completely dependent. They had other crops like wheat and corn, but basically everybody in Ireland who was Irish and poor, everybody was growing potatoes. So it was a complete disaster for Ireland. Why were they all growing potatoes? Why didn't they have other ways to support themselves? Well, that's where, the buck stops there. The British Empire was responsible for the poverty of Ireland in general. They made all these laws. For one, they took land away from Irish people, and they forced them to give the land. If you owned land and you're Irish, you had to divide it amongst your children. So they keep these big wealthy estates together by giving them to the first son, which sounds like, hey, that's not fair. But you know what happens over generations if you split your property into, 4, and then you split it into 4 again. You split it into 4, then you have all these less wealthy, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so none of the big wealthy families in Ireland were able to maintain their power and their wealth. So, gradually they all became poor. So the only thing worse than, most people being poor is everybody being poor. So another reason why Ireland wasn't able to unify itself is because they had no natural leaders. You may look at the history of the British Empire and say, oh, well, there's all these famous people and they did all these great things. It's not like the poor people weren't smart or didn't have talent, but they didn't have the resources to use it. So you end up with a very powerful upper class in the British Empire, in England and Scotland. Like I said, the Enlightenment, you have all these literate, educated, talented, wealthy individuals, many of them, and they're capable of great leadership. And all the other qualities aside, whether they're good people or not, or their personal lives, how they conduct themselves is not the point. It's just they have the resources and the ability to lead the nation to become more powerful. And Ireland has none of these things. They have many, many talented individuals, and their talents are never allowed to develop, mostly because of the British imperial system of preventing them from having any of those means, and those opportunities are denied to anybody who's Irish and Catholic. So when they move over to the United States, they are discriminated against. They're treated like second-class citizens. Eventually, they start to move into, the social mobility of the American society allows them to improve their situation. But we're talking, hundreds of years before. You get John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, right? That's not that long ago. It's 20 years before I was born. John F. Kennedy's an Irish Catholic president. He's the first. Not to mention that we've had our first black president, Barack Obama, only recently, just 5 or 6 years ago. Still no women of any background. But Irish Catholic in the 1960s. So you have 200 years of American history before an Irish Catholic is allowed to be the leader. And the Irish were there long before that. So you might say there's none of the founding fathers are Irish. None of the leaders of the 13 colonies are Irish that I'm aware of. They probably have some Irish blood, possibly, but they're excluded, right? So but the thing is, racism, the racism against Irish people has faded finally, but it was there. And it had more to do with religion than it had to do with skin color. And probably one of the reasons that Irish people were gradually accepted more is because of the rise of racism, where people cared about what you look like and what your skin tone is. If you're very pink or a little bit pink like me, right? I'm not very white. Sometimes I'm more pink than the other, depending on whether I was out in the sun. But you know what I mean. They start to categorize and discriminate against people based on their skin color rather than whether they're Baptist, Catholic, Lutheran, Puritan, Quaker, Presbyterian. That becomes less and less important. Okay, so thank you, Ireland, for making your appearance. Very important part, but we have to move on. This is the way they spell Ireland in Irish. Ere, I believe. Ere is the word for Ireland in their own language. I don't speak Irish, but maybe that's close to the pronunciation. So let's talk about. I just talked about page 154 and 155. It gives you a breakdown of how ever since William the Conqueror comes, the English kings are constantly going over there. Our old friend Henry II, of course, Henry II did something, right? He didn't just chew carpets and, make saints by killing the archbishop. He didn't kill him. Let's remember that's for the exam. His 4 men killed him, but he not only had big fights with his wife, and his son was Richard the Lionheart, and his other son, Prince John, became King John and signed the Magna Carta. He didn't only do all that, he also invaded Ireland, and he was one of the first English kings to really impose some sort of imperial influence. It wasn't an empire at that point, technically, but I told you he was the Angevin, right? His father was Geoffrey of Anjou, so he was Angevin. He was actually, his father was French, Anjou, French, so Angevin. But he had land. He fought against the Scots. He fought against the French, and he was in Ireland. And this is his contemporary, the guy who was divorced by Eleanor of Aquitaine, who she added the land to his empire too, the Angevin Empire, some people call it. Louis the Pious, who was divorced with her, he was amazed by Henry II's ability to be, now he's in Ireland, now he's in Scotland, now he's in Anjou, now he's in Normandy. He's everywhere at once. He was known for, he's a very interesting guy, very mixed reviews, but very, very energetic and, as you know, angry, temperamental person, but very accomplished. And he, of course, invaded Ireland and started the process of dividing and planting, English people, English culture, and they're all Catholic at this point. So he's just trying to control the island and harness its resources for his own kingdom. Okay, so from that discussion of Ireland, we jump right into the Industrial Revolution in the book. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the Commercial Revolution here. Let's talk about the Agricultural Revolution first, should we? Or is that, we're going to do that after. We're going to do that after because of the order of the book. I think I got to change the order here. But the second Agricultural Revolution has a lot to do with, these things are related to each other. There's kind of this triangular, I've drawn some arrows already. The Industrial Revolution, all of these things are going to be tied together. Like I said to you, slavery is involved in a lot of these things, and they're all feeding into each other. So let's do the Commercial Revolution first. So the Europeans explore, and we talked about Christopher Columbus. He's one of the individuals that sets off this age of exploration. And 100 years after he goes to America, Sir Francis Drake will be the first captain. Magellan is the first one to start an expedition, but he dies halfway around the world in the Philippines. You probably know Magellan from history class or high school. But Francis Drake is the first person to circumnavigate the globe as the captain of the ship. And he doesn't just go around the world like Magellan does. He goes around attacking Spanish ships and capturing spices and gold and trade goods as he goes. So that's Elizabeth's time, right? That's during the Armada, Spanish Armada era. So 16th century. Francis Drake goes around the world. This is part of the age of exploration. These people are making trade routes, right? One of the reasons is because in 1453, Constantinople falls and the Ottoman Turks take control of Turkey. That's why it's called Turkey, and it's Istanbul, not Constantinople anymore, because the Islamic Turks take it over, and they are blocking the Italians, especially the Italians, but everybody. That's why Italy was so rich before 1453. The Italian Renaissance happened, and the states of Italy became so wealthy is because they controlled the trade routes to Asia. Everybody wants to go to Asia. Columbus wants to go to India. It's Asia, and that's how the Black Death comes too. The Italian merchants are in the Black Sea, and they get exposed to the Black Death when there's some Mongolian Tartars laying siege to a city, and they bring the plague from China all the way across Asia and down the Black Sea by Constantinople into the Italian ports, and then it spreads over Europe and kills everybody. All this stuff is related to the main object: spices and silks and gold and silver and precious things, right? These luxury goods, especially spices, right? This will promote the effort to find ways to get there, which will result in Columbus's voyage and other. Vasco da Gama goes around Africa. The Portuguese and the Spanish will lead the way, and then Francis Drake will go around the world too, and the English and the French will get involved in it. And this is part of the commercial revolution. These trade routes going around the world. The main object is to reach Asia, and even back in the Roman times, the Romans were. It's hard to imagine, but the Romans really were obsessed with pepper. Pepper came from India, and the pepper trade, black pepper, coming through from India all the way through on the land route through Persia and past the Saudi peninsula into the Mediterranean was very, very valuable. The rich Roman people put pepper on their food, and everybody else didn't, right? So the same thing happens in the early modern period. Is the rich people want their pepper and their nutmeg and their cloves and all the things you can buy, all the dried spices that you can buy in Home Plus. They wanted those things. It's incredibly expensive. Like, just think of spices being like diamonds, right? The same sort of. If you bring a ship full of spices back to Europe, it's like winning the lottery. You could die very easily going to the Philippines or going to India or going to China. But if you brought back that cargo, that ship full of luxuries, of spices and silks and ceramics, pottery, this kind of stuff, if you bring it back, you're set. You're rich. Even if you're not even the captain, you're not even the owner of the ship, The Merchant of Venice is a Shakespearean play that's talking about, Italians trying to, invest in ships, and like their ships are supposed to come back, and they sink, and then they're ruined because they invested so much money. But if they come back, it doesn't matter how much, money they borrow. That's why they borrow this money from Shylock, and the interest rate is out of control. He actually just wants a pound of flesh. But if you borrowed money, it wouldn't matter. If you borrow money at something crazy like 20% or 30% interest in 1 year, if your ship comes back, it doesn't matter, because you make 1,000% or 2,000% on your ship coming back. So who cares if you borrow 30, make a loan at 30%, you're going to make, 25 times your money. So no big deal. So this powers exploration, and it powers this growth. As I told you before, the population goes up, right? New trade routes happen. There's this. The system becomes based on bankers and merchants, right? The Merchant of Venice, instead of guilds. So this is a transition from, we talked about I said the Age of Enlightenment, and I said the Age of Exploration, and I said it's, medieval. Like when Christopher Columbus goes to North America, he's a medieval person. Like the Spanish Inquisition is going to be burning people and torturing people and looking for people who are not Christian and people who have alternative lifestyles, and it's going to be torturing them horribly. Like this is the medieval world that he's involved in, right? Only the year that he leaves is like the end of the Reconquista. So, Spain is unified. Like 1 year, 1491, 1 year before Christopher Columbus leaves, Spain is unified as a Christian kingdom. It's always been the Spain's, and it was a Muslim, it was a Muslim territory. The last part of it is called Granada, which is still a place in Spain, but it was Islam. It was an Islamic caliphate, and it was taken back by the Spanish Christians. This process takes like 700 years. Spain is conquered by an Islamic, army, and then it's for hundreds of years. It's an Islamic country, and just at the beginning of the early modern period, Spain becomes a Christian kingdom. And we often think of Spain as the Christian kingdom, but it wasn't. It's been 500 years. So that's why we think of Spain as a very Christian place. But it was actually, for hundreds of years, it was Islamic, and then it gradually became more and more Christian. But there was lots of mixing, right? There was lots of mixing there. There was Jewish people and people of alternative versions of Christianity, what they would call heretics. And the Spanish Inquisition was an attempt by the Catholic Church to crack down on everybody and make everybody follow the Christian King of Spain and the Pope. And it worked, because it was horrible and scary. Those people were experts. Anyway, the guilds was a system that managed the economy. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, you wanted to be a roof tiler like Wat Tyler, or you wanted to be, you remember him from the Peasants' Revolt, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt. If you wanted to have any trade where you made something or crafted something, you wanted to have a craft, whether you're a shoemaker or a tailor or whatever, you had to join a guild. You had to pay the guild, and the guild would train you, and you'd be an apprentice, then you'd be a journeyman, and then you'd be a master. And prices basically just stayed the same. This is medieval stuff. You had to join this official group, this guild system. They had an international group, which is called the Hanseatic League, and they organized the economy. That system was very inefficient. It's not like capitalism. Literally, your grandfather would have paid the same price for shoes as you. The guild actually set the prices. So I'm a shoemaker and I live in London, the price should be lower or higher? Well, if there's lots of shoemakers in London, maybe the price will go down because there's, there's a higher supply, there's a higher demand, but it depends on the supply and demand. If I live in Manchester or Norwich or a smaller city and there's less competition, maybe the price will be higher because maybe it's harder for me to get the leather for the shoes, so it costs me more to make the shoe, and there's less supply because there's less shoemakers. So, the price of a shoe in Manchester is not going to be the same as the price in London. But under the guild system, it was. You had to sell your product at the price that the guild told you to. So it was not a flexible market. Bankers and merchants are going to put money out there. They're going to lend money and provide capital, which is the word for investment that we call, that's where we get the word capitalism from, capital. They're going to provide the capital for people to make, investments together and do things individually. None of these systems existed. This is all part of the commercial revolution. And England does this first. The British Empire does it first. And this is one of the reasons that the Industrial Revolution happened in England. It's another reason why the British Empire defeated France repeatedly in their wars, because even though the British had less people and less resources and a smaller military, their economic system, they had a financial system that was superior to the French system. So they could outspend the French, right? They could outspend Spain. They could outspend anybody because they were able to generate investment and tax more efficiently. And so even though the French king had more power, political power, he would be able to impose taxes on his people, but he would still generate less money than the English would by having lower tax rates because there's more money in the system. So of course they can get more money. So they just really, the French military gets a bad rap sometimes because of certain wars and battles. But overall, the French military is one of the best militaries in history. They've defeated, if you look at the number of battles and how many battles they've won and the numbers and everything, you will see that France is one of the greatest military nations that's ever existed. Maybe only a few other countries have better records, like the United States and the British. Okay? But that's not, and the Germans too. But just because you have one great defeat doesn't mean your military is not powerful. It's just, in this case, what became more important was the fact that England could support its military longer, and they could invest more money in their military for equipment and for higher pay, and all of these things makes your military function better. So we got population growth. We have the second agricultural revolution, which I would like you to read about yourself, because this is going to free the food. The agricultural revolution is going to go into this food surplus situation, right? So there's going to be a population boom, which it's already happening. It's already happening in the 17th century and the 18th century, but it's gonna accelerate. There's gonna be more and more people because there's enough food that starvation becomes less and less of an issue. And through various innovations, including rotating crops and a different kind of plow and using horses instead of oxen and transportation systems and the commercial system, the food can be moved around. They're making more food, they're moving it around better. They start using fertilizers. There's new kinds of food, right? Like in America, they start planting rice. The Columbian Exchange is allowing all these different kinds of plants to be grown. Potatoes are being grown, which potatoes come from Peru. They're not a European thing. They have corn. All these things are new. They're not, this has a huge influence on the population. China's population explodes because of the introduction of new foods too. When the corn and potatoes make it over to China, they start planting these new crops and they mix them. They're more nutritious than rice, turns out, not necessarily tastier or better suited to certain parts of Asia, but then you can add to it, right? So some parts of China are not ideal for planting rice, but you can plant potatoes there. So you got potatoes and corn and rice, and you just have this diversity of food, which when you have food surplus, it means you can do all these other things. Like, for example, if you have extra food, then you can use it to feed your soldiers. If you have extra food, you can turn that corn and turn that wheat and barley into beer and whiskey, and you can use that excess food to make different products, right? You can make oil, all kinds of stuff. So this enables you to start developing other kinds. Sugar, right? Sugar is not a necessity. It's a luxury. It's a luxury food. Coffee, do you need coffee? Maybe you think so, but you're not going to die if you don't have your coffee. So you're not going to die if you don't have your sugar, but if you have the money and you have the resources, you want it. And this gives sugar the nickname white gold. And pretty soon, the other products we mentioned, cotton and tobacco, they're all going to be involved. Okay. So there's all kinds of things that are feeding into this. Those are the major things that I want you to know. They use a kind of capitalism hasn't really, the free market doesn't exist yet, but they use this mercantile system where it's a closed system where the colonies provide the resources, and the developed home country, the mother country, does the manufacturing. And this is fundamental to what propels the Industrial Revolution. There's three main things that contribute to the Industrial Revolution. One is technology, which is to be able to make things out of iron. The technology comes from Sweden, and the English learn how to do it, and then they start making things that are machines that are heavy and big, and then that they can do, they're made out of metal, so they can do, these are machines that will eventually be put into factories, right? So they can do all these things. They need the material, and they need the energy, which is steam power. They figure out how to make these large machines move without using human energy, power, or animal power, this is the truly revolutionary thing, is that for thousands and thousands of years, everything was driven by living organisms and using the energy of human beings and domesticated animals. That's why we still say horsepower, right? When you talk about a car and you say, how powerful is that car? You say it's 200 horsepower. It has the same power as 200 horses, because for thousands of years, that was the standard. If you have one horse, you have 1 horsepower. If you have 10 horses, you have 10 horsepower. So this decouples this, I can only have so many horses. You can't actually do work with 200 horses at once. You can't make a machine and have 200 horses pull it. It doesn't work. But if you can concentrate the power of 200 horses into the space of a room, which 200 horses would never fit, then you can harness this power that's exponentially stronger than oxen or even elephants, right? As strong as they are, they're not going to compare to a gigantic steam-powered locomotive. A locomotive, a steam engine, or a steamboat has more power than an elephant easily. And it can pull huge amounts of cargo. They can transport immense amounts of stuff. So the third thing, of course, is you need the product. And they're going to take cotton, right? The resource is cotton, and the product is textiles. They're going to make cloth. They're going to make cloth, and they're going to make it faster and cheaper and in more in bigger numbers than anybody's ever seen before. And no country, even a country like, even a place like India or the Chinese Empire, even with all of their labor, even with all of their people, they will not be able to keep up to the British in terms of production, because that's what the revolution is. They increased their production at such a great rate that nobody, no matter how big a territory or how many people they have, nobody can keep up. The Americans can't keep up, the French can't keep up, the Indians can't keep up, neither can the Chinese. So by the mid-19th century, even though the population of China is 20 times larger than England, England will have a larger economy and be far outproducing the Chinese in terms of products. And that's due to the Industrial Revolution. And as I said before, part of the reason it's so successful is because we have the resource coming in from Indian labor and American slave labor, right? These are, the labor is cheap, and it's very, the amount of it is, the pool of labor is huge. Millions in America and millions in India are producing this material, which the British can use to make a finished product and earn, amazing amounts of money. Which, as I said, this is already, you can see how these things are feeding into each other. The Industrial Revolution provides all these machines that enables them to transport things more effectively, produce things more effectively. That makes more money. The money gets put back into the system, and then you reinvest it in more land and more labor, and it just keeps growing, right? So despite the fact that America is now on its separate path, and I should have said this from the beginning of the class, we are talking about the British Empire today for one class. But before we go back to America again, next class, but all of these systems are going to be supporting each other. Okay, so you're going to have to read over this a little bit. There's a little bit on capitalism and Adam Smith. And then at the end of this chapter, it talks about the history of the British Navy before I talk about Charles Dickens and Jane Austen. But Charles Dickens and Jane Austen we will save for next class because it doesn't really fit. And I've only got 10 minutes left here. So let's talk about Napoleon and Nelson. Okay, so the easiest way for you to describe Yi Sun-shin to a British person is to say Yi Sun-shin is the Admiral Nelson of Korea. Okay, there's a statue of him in Seoul. He's got his hand on his sword, and he's lunging forward like he's going to do battle with somebody. It's a great statue, and you probably realize by now I'm a big Yi Sun-shin fan. I've read Nanjung Ilgi, and I've read Chingbirok, and I know who Yu Sung-yong is, and I know Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and I know a lot of Ieoki and Il and all those guys. I've read about the Imjin Weiran a lot, more than 10 books, and less about Nelson, but I'll tell you about Nelson. The similarities in the undefeated aspect of their careers. Nelson didn't have the kind of same level of domination that Yi Sun-shin did. If you know the battles that Yi Sun-shin had with the turtle ship and the Panok Sun and the Kalbuk Sun and everything, he obliterated the Japanese. So there was, he lost 5 guys, and the Japanese would lose thousands, and he would sink all their ships and have 1 ship damaged, almost untouched. Nelson couldn't do that because the ships that he was using were of very similar design. So when he was fighting the French and the Spanish fleets, he was fighting with these 80 cannon ships of the line, and they go sideways and then they fire broadsides. Yi Sun-shin had cannons on his ships, and the Japanese ships were just not the same level of quality. They were more designed, to to grapple and for Japanese soldiers to jump on the other ship. But Yi Sun-shin didn't let them do that. He just shot them to pieces, and his more heavily armored ships just kept in tight formations and then just blew them up from far away. Nelson couldn't do that. What Nelson had to do is, just tactically and strategically beat another version of himself, right? As if Yi Sun-shin was fighting Panoksan and Kabuksan. I'm sure he would have, because he was a genius. But that's not what he had to deal with. Nelson had to deal with French admirals and Spanish admirals who had similar types of weapons and crews. So his advantages were he had this kind of invincible aura about him, this confidence and this bravery that inspired his soldiers so much that they were willing to die for him and do anything. And in battle, you can't underestimate. He had revolutionized the signaling system. So, I mean, it already existed, but this series of flags, he would run up flags, and the captains of his ships would do exactly what he said. And they were all equally committed to defeating the enemy, whoever it was, it's amazing because in a sense, of course, Yi Sun-shin was inspiring and brave and sometimes reckless and very confident, but the Chosun soldiers and sailors, they were fighting to defend their kingdom. In the case of the battles that Nelson fought against Napoleon's fleet, they were defending England in some situations, but for example, he fights a famous battle north of Egypt. It's called the Battle of the Nile. At the mouth of the river Nile in Egypt, he completely eradicates the ships that are supposed to protect Napoleon's army and bring him home from his expedition in Egypt. And once Nelson destroys all those ships, Napoleon's army is stuck in Egypt and has no way to get back there. So he ends up going on campaign and taking over Egypt anyway, but the only way Napoleon can get back to France is to escape and in disguise, get across the Mediterranean by himself and abandon his army. And the British accept his expeditionary army's surrender in Egypt because they can't be resupplied, and Napoleon abandons them there. Just one of the occasions where his brilliance in a battle far away, thousands of kilometers away from his home base in England, in the southern part of England, shows how committed he was and how committed his sailors and captains were to the cause. So he ends up fighting in this battle called Trafalgar. He's been actually, he's won, just like Yi Sun-shin, he's won quite a few battles, and the French and Spanish fleets are trying to avoid him, just like they did to Yi Sun-shin. They don't want to fight him anymore because they know what's going to happen. But he sails his fleet across to the Caribbean near Jamaica and Cuba, looking for the French fleet. Can't find them. Comes back. He thinks they keep missing each other by small amounts of time and small distances. But he catches up with them and meets them at Trafalgar. And the combined French-Spanish fleet has twice as many ships, and Nelson engages them, splits their line in half. You're not supposed to do this, actually. It's called crossing the T. But anyway, that's not important. He does a very aggressive maneuver and attacks the French-Spanish line, and he ends up splitting their line so that they can't fire at him, but he can fire at them. And it's just a bloodbath. It's a crazy battle. I've seen it reenacted on YouTube before. It's called the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is the end of Napoleon. He needs to defeat Nelson so that he can get his soldiers to England, because he has a massive, unstoppable army. And if he can get that army, the Grand Armée, which will eventually go to Russia and die there, but this army that he's formed is just well-trained, well-disciplined, high morale. If they get to England, the British Empire's done. So Nelson's got to win this battle, just like Myeongnyang. It's basically the English version. So he wins the battle at Trafalgar, and just like Yi Sun-shin, he gets shot. He's already got one arm because he had his arm ripped off, in a battle before. But he doesn't care. He stands on the deck of his ship anyway with one arm for the rest of his career, and he watches the battle from there. Even though there's cannonballs and bullets flying everywhere, and he's wearing a big admiral's hat, so he's an easy target. This is kind of George Washington style. French sniper shoots him, it goes right through his body, and a couple hours later he dies, but he doesn't let his sailors and soldiers know until the battle is over, just like in Noryang, Yi Sun-shin didn't either. So very similar, in the way that they died, and their commitment and their charisma, their genius for strategy and tactics. So that's Nelson. He's a legend. If you go to London, you can go to Trafalgar Square, which is named after the battle, and you can look at the pedestal, and Nelson is standing there with his one arm, staring across at France from the pedestal. It's fantastic. I have a picture of myself and him when I went to London in 2011. One of my heroes, to be sure, and the reason that I know so much about Yi Sun-shin is because of Nelson, because of the stories I knew about him. So that's the picture there in the book, right? That's him standing there with his one arm and his sword, staring, daring Napoleon to invade. So read over the legacy there. We already talked about Pax Britannica. Like I said, that was not the end of Napoleon. Trafalgar was only 1805. He died, but he stopped the potential for France to win control of the ocean was gone. So it would be 10 more years before Napoleon was defeated, but the British look at Nelson as the hero that stopped Napoleon that protected England. And Lord Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, the guy who won the general who won the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 against the resurgent Napoleon, he's the one who defeated Napoleon, right? So they got those two guys, Nelson and the Duke of Waterloo, the Lord Wellington. Sorry, not the Duke of Waterloo, Duke of Wellington, the victor of the Battle of Waterloo. He should be in this book too. I'm actually gonna have to do a 4th edition next year. So, but don't worry about Wellington. Just read the part about Nelson and Trafalgar and what effect he had, his legacy, right? Pax Britannica, how the Royal Navy behaved for 100 years afterwards. That's all because of him. And there's an interesting anecdote there to the reason that one of the stories about how much his soldiers loved him is his funeral. There's a little story there about how they paid homage to him by drinking the rum which his body was stored in. It's a pretty interesting story. Check that out too on page 172. So that's it for today. Right at the end, I'm going to talk about the end of this chapter. Will conclude at the beginning of next lecture when I talk about Dickens, Jane Austen, and Mark Twain. And then we are going to talk about the American frontier, the American Civil War, slavery and the native. I mean, we already talked about slavery, but add a little bit to that because of its importance in the Civil War. And we'll conclude chapter 6 with a discussion of Native Americans. That's on the docket for Friday. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. That's almost exactly an hour, so we did our duty. And I hope you have a good week until I meet you again on Friday. I hope the quiz went well. See you Friday morning, 11 o'clock.